The maid is in love with her married boss, while the gardener secretly loves her. The wife discovers it and takes a surprising action. The morning sun filtered through the silk curtains of the Bowers mansion, casting a golden glow over the marble floor of the entrance hall. Grace, the devoted 28-year-old maid, moved with the grace of a ballerina between the rooms, her silent footsteps echoing softly through the corridors. Her brown eyes, always attentive, scanned every detail of the room, making sure everything was in perfect order. When she entered the living room, Grace saw a familiar scene. Toys scattered across the Persian carpet, silent witnesses to the joy of the Bowers children. With a soft smile on her lips, she began to collect the little treasures, her movements fluid and precise. As she organized the toys in a wicker basket, her eyes were drawn beyond the French doors that led into the office. There stood Richard Bowers, the family patriarch, engrossed in a business meeting. Grace couldn't help but let her heart race as she watched him. Richard, at 40, was the embodiment of success and elegance. His impeccably cut suit accentuated his athletic figure, and his blue eyes shone with an intensity that Grace found irresistible. She watched him gesture emphatically, his deep voice audible even through the glass. The determination on his face was evident, reflecting the passion he devoted to every aspect of his life. Grace felt a familiar twinge of admiration and something more, a feeling she struggled to suppress day after day. Will he ever see me as more than just an employee? Grace asked herself, allowing herself a moment of reverie. Quickly, however, she pushed these thoughts aside, mentally scolding herself. Richard was a married man, and she knew her feelings were inappropriate and potentially destructive. While Grace finished tidying the room, Richard concluded his meeting. He stood up, rubbing his temples, the tiredness evident in his eyes. As he left the office, his gaze met Grace's, and for a brief moment, something passed between them. A spark of recognition, perhaps even connection. Grace felt her face heat up and quickly looked away, pretending to be busy tidying up. Richard hesitated for a moment, as if he wanted to say something, but then shook his head almost imperceptibly and headed for the kitchen. Grace watched him go, her heart beating a little faster than usual. In the kitchen, Richard poured himself a cup of coffee, his mind wandering away from business and settling on his personal life. Clara, his wife, was upstairs, probably still asleep. Lately, they seemed to live on completely different schedules, as if they inhabited parallel worlds within the same house. Richard sighed, realizing that he couldn't remember the last time he and Clara had had a genuine conversation other than about the children or social engagements. The connection that had once bound them together seemed to be fading, leaving a void that Richard didn't know how to fill. His thoughts were interrupted when Grace entered the kitchen, carrying a pile of clean towels. She smiled gently at him, a simple gesture that for some reason warmed Richard's heart. "Good morning, Mr. Bowers," she said softly. "I hope the meeting was productive." Richard found himself smiling back, almost without realizing it. "Good morning, Grace. Yes, it was interesting." He paused, feeling a sudden urge to prolong the conversation. "And how's your day been so far?" Grace looked surprised by the question, but answered truthfully. "It's quiet, sir. Just the routine tasks." Richard nodded, suddenly aware of how little he knew about Grace's daily life, even though she had been a constant presence in his home for years. "Well, don't let me stop you from going on," he said, feeling strangely awkward. Grace bowed slightly and left the kitchen, leaving Richard with a sense of missed opportunity, although he didn't know exactly what he had missed. Outside the mansion, Michael, the 30-year-old gardener, was carefully pruning the rose bushes. His green eyes, gentle and observant, followed Grace through the windows of the house whenever she passed by. Michael had had deep feelings for Grace for months, enchanted by her gentleness and serene beauty. As he worked, Michael mentally rehearsed different ways of getting closer to Grace, of expressing his feelings. But every time the opportunity arose, his shyness paralyzed him and the words died in his throat. "Today," he muttered to himself, determined. "Today I'm going to talk to her." The hours passed, and the Bowers mansion continued its apparently quiet routine. Grace moved around the rooms like a guardian spirit, keeping everything in order. Richard alternated between meetings and moments of solitary reflection in his study. Clara remained in her chambers, involved in phone calls and planning for future social events. In the afternoon, while Grace was watering the plants on the terrace, Michael finally plucked up the courage to approach. His heart racing, he climbed the steps, holding a small bouquet of flowers he had picked from the garden. "Hi, Grace," he said, his voice betraying a slight tremor. Grace turned, surprised, but smiled warmly when she saw Michael. "Hello, Michael. What beautiful flowers." Michael held out the bouquet, his face blushing slightly. They're for you. I thought you might like them." Grace accepted the flowers, touched by the gesture. "They're wonderful, Michael. Thank you so much." For a moment they stood there, a comfortable silence hanging between them. Michael opened his mouth to say something more, to finally express his feelings, but at that moment Richard's voice sounded from inside the house, calling for Grace. The moment was broken. Grace cast an apologetic glance at Michael and hurried inside, leaving the gardener with the unspoken words weighing heavily on his chest. As the day drew to a close, each inhabitant of the Bowers mansion retreated into their own thoughts and secrets. Grace, in her small room at the back of the house, gazed at Michael's bouquet, feeling torn between the gardener's kindness and her unrequited feelings for Richard. Richard, in his study, looked out of the window, his thoughts oscillating between his business worries and a growing unease about his marriage. His eyes wandered to the garden, where he saw Michael working late, and for a moment he felt a twinge of something that could be jealousy, although he couldn't explain why. Clara, alone in her room, flipped distractedly through a magazine, feeling the weight of the distance that was growing between her and Richard. She wondered if he still loved her, if he still saw her as the woman he had fallen in love with years ago. And Michael, putting his tools away in the garden shed, promised himself that tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, he would find the right words to tell Grace how he felt. Night fell over the Bowers mansion, enveloping it in shadows and silence. But beneath the calm surface, turbulent emotions were bubbling up, ready to spill over. The stage was set for a drama of broken hearts, tested loyalties, and forbidden loves, a complex web of emotions that threatened to unravel the carefully stitched fabric of life in the mansion. The Bowers mansion buzzed with an almost palpable energy in the days leading up to the big gala dinner. Clara Bowers, the hostess par excellence, moved through the rooms with the precision of a conductor conducting a complex orchestra. Her blue eyes shone with a mixture of excitement and determination as she checked and rechecked every detail of the event. "Grace," called Clara, her voice echoing through the halls of the mansion, "I need you to check with the florist that the white orchids have arrived. They're essential for the centerpieces." Grace appeared promptly, her serene face masking the whirlwind of emotions that consumed her internally. "Yes, Mrs. Bowers, I'll do it right away." Clara smiled, pleased. "Good. Oh, and please remind Richard that he has to try on the tux today. You know how he always leaves these things to the last minute." Grace nodded, feeling a slight tightening in her chest at the thought of Richard. "Of course, Ma'am. I'll let Mr. Bowers know as soon as I see him." While Clara turned her attention to the endless list of tasks, Grace headed for Richard's office. She knocked softly on the door, waiting for the familiar answer. "Come in," came Richard's deep voice from the other side. Grace opened the door, finding Richard leaning over a pile of documents. He looked up, and for a moment Grace felt as if time had stopped. Richard's gaze seemed to soften at the sight of her, a small smile appearing on his lips. "Grace," he said, his tone softer than usual, "what can I do for you?" Grace swallowed, remembering her purpose. "Mrs. Bowers asked me to remind you to try on the tux today, sir." Richard sighed, running his hand through the grey hair at his temples. "Oh yes, the gala dinner. I almost forgot." He paused, seeming to consider something. "Grace, could you help me with that? I have a conference call in half an hour and I won't have time to go to the tailor's." Grace's heart raced. "Me? But I don't know if—" Richard smiled, a smile that made Grace's knees go weak. "I'm sure you have a great eye for such things. Besides, I trust your judgment more than mine when it comes to appearances." Grace blushed slightly, nodding. "All right, sir. I'll be happy to help." Meanwhile, in the garden, Michael was hard at work, determined to make the outside of the mansion as stunning as the inside for the big event. His calloused hands moved deftly between the plants, pruning, tidying, creating a visual symphony of colors and textures. His thoughts, however, were far from the flowers. Michael couldn't stop thinking about Grace and the moment they had shared the day before. Her smile when she received the flowers still warmed his heart, but Richard's interruption left a bitter taste in his mouth. "I need to do something special," Michael muttered to himself, his eyes scanning the garden for inspiration. Suddenly, an idea struck him. He would create a unique floral arrangement, something that would stand out even amidst the opulence of the gala dinner, something that would make Grace notice not only the flowers, but also the man behind them. Back at the mansion, Richard followed Grace into the main closet, where his tuxedo was waiting for him. Grace tried to maintain a professional posture as she helped Richard put on his jacket, but the closeness between them was electrifying. "How are you?" asked Richard, turning to Grace. Grace took a step back, her eyes roaming over Richard's imposing figure. The tuxedo fit perfectly, accentuating his broad shoulders and elegant posture. For a moment, Grace allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to be in his arms, dancing in a candle-lit ballroom. "It's perfect, sir," she managed to say, her voice huskier than she had intended. Richard watched her for a long moment, something indefinable shining in his eyes. "Grace, Richard, are you there?" Clara's voice sounded from the hallway, breaking the moment. Richard blinked as if coming out of a trance. "Yes, dear, I'm trying on the tuxedo." Clara entered the closet, her eyes critically assessing Richard. "Oh, it looks great. Grace, you have an excellent eye. Thanks for helping." Grace nodded, retreating to the door. "Excuse me," she muttered, leaving quickly. Clara turned to Richard, her face lighting up with excitement. "The planning is almost complete. This dinner will be remembered for years." Richard forced a smile, trying to ignore the feeling of emptiness that filled him at Grace's departure. "I'm sure it will, dear. You always exceed expectations." As the day progressed, the Bowers mansion continued its transformation. Teams of decorators came and went, carrying elaborate floral arrangements, silk tablecloths, and silverware. Clara oversaw everything with an eagle eye, making sure that every detail was up to her standards. Grace moved through the corridors like a shadow, efficient and discreet. She helped wherever she could, always attentive to the needs of the Bowers and the team, but her thoughts kept returning to that moment in the closet, to Richard's gaze, to the unspoken words that seemed to hang between them. In the garden, Michael was putting the finishing touches to his special arrangement. It was a stunning composition of white roses and orchids, with subtle touches of lavender and ivy. Each flower was chosen with care, each leaf positioned with precision. For Michael, it wasn't just an arrangement, it was a statement, an expression of his deepest feelings. As evening approached, the tension in the mansion reached its peak. Clara ran around, checking and rechecking every detail. Richard locked himself in his study, claiming to have urgent work, but actually seeking a moment's peace away from the chaos. Grace, exhausted after a day of intense preparations, finally allowed herself a moment's rest. Sitting on a discreet bench in the back garden, she closed her eyes, letting the evening breeze caress her face. "Grace?" She opened her eyes, surprised to see Michael standing in front of her, holding his special floral arrangement. "Michael," she smiled, her eyes widening at the sight of the flowers. "This is amazing." Michael smiled shyly, holding out the arrangement to her. "It's for you. I wanted to create something special, something that expressed..." He hesitated, gathering his courage. "Something that expresses how I feel about you." Grace was speechless, touched by the beauty of the flowers and the sincerity in Michael's eyes. She opened her mouth to reply, but was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Richard appeared around the bend in the path, stopping abruptly when he saw Grace and Michael. His eyes narrowed slightly as he noticed the floral arrangement. "Ah, Grace, I was looking for you," said Richard, his voice strangely tense. "Clara needs help with the last details." Grace stood up quickly, casting an apologetic glance at Michael. "Of course, sir, I'll be right there." She hesitated for a moment, then took the arrangement from Michael's hands. "Thank you, Michael." It's beautiful." As Grace hurried back to the mansion, Richard and Michael exchanged a look full of unspoken emotions. For a brief moment, both men felt the weight of the silent competition forming between them. Richard was the first to break the silence. "Good job with the garden, Michael. It's impressive." Michael nodded stiffly. "Thank you, sir." With one last glance in the direction Grace had gone, Richard turned and walked back to the mansion, leaving Michael alone with his thoughts and the echo of a missed opportunity. Night was falling over the Bowers estate, bringing with it the promise of a dazzling event. But beneath the glittering surface of champagne and practiced smiles, turbulent emotions were bubbling up, ready to spill over. The stage was set, the actors in their places. The gala dinner would be more than just a social celebration. It would be the catalyst for changes that none of those involved could have foreseen. The day of the gala dinner finally arrived, bringing with it an atmosphere of anticipation and nervousness that permeated every corner of the Bowers mansion. The air was full of expectation, not only for the social event of the year, but also for the personal dramas that were quietly unfolding behind the scenes. Grace woke up before dawn, her heart heavy with a mixture of conflicting emotions. She dressed mechanically, preparing for a day that promised to be as exhausting emotionally as it was physically. As she left her room, she was immediately engulfed by the frenetic bustle taking over the house. "Grace, thank God you're up," Clara exclaimed, suddenly appearing in the hallway. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of panic and determination. "We need to check the flowers for the tables. The central arrangement for the head table hasn't arrived yet, and I'm having a terrible feeling about it." Grace nodded, forcing a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, Mrs. Bowers. I'll call the florist right away and sort it out." Clara breathed a sigh of relief. "What would I do without you, Grace? Oh, and when you've finished with the flowers, could you help Richard choose the wines for dinner? He's in the wine cellar, and knowing him, he's probably still undecided." Grace's heart leapt at the thought of being alone with Richard, but she kept her composure. "Of course, Mum. I'll take care of it as soon as I've sorted out the flowers." As Grace headed for the phone to contact the florist, her thoughts wandered to Michael and his beautiful arrangement from the night before. For a moment, she considered suggesting using Michael's arrangement as a centerpiece, but hesitated. Would it be appropriate? And how would Richard react? After a tense conversation with the florist, who assured her that the centerpiece would be delivered on time, Grace headed for the wine cellar. She descended the stone stairs, feeling the air become cooler and more humid as she went deeper into the basement of the mansion. "Mr. Bowers?" she called softly, her voice echoing faintly among the shelves of aged wines. "Back here, Grace," came Richard's reply. Grace found him in a remote corner of the basement, surrounded by open bottles and half-full glasses. Richard seemed lost in thought, absent-mindedly swirling a glass of red wine in his hand. "Clara asked me to help you with the wine selection," Grace explained, approaching cautiously. Richard looked up, a tired smile playing on his lips. "Ah, yes. Apparently, I can't be trusted to make that choice myself." He gestured to the bottles around him. "What do you think, Grace? Bordeaux or Burgundy for the main course?" Grace moved closer, her eyes roaming over the labels of the bottles. She could feel the heat emanating from Richard's body, his closeness making her heart race. "Well, considering the menu Mrs. Bowers has planned, I'd say the Burgundy would be an excellent choice. It will complement the flavor of the lamb well." Richard looked at her with a mixture of surprise and admiration. "You know your wine?" Grace blushed slightly. "Just the basics, sir. I learned a bit working at events like this." "You never cease to amaze me, Grace," Richard murmured, his eyes fixed on her. He reached out, picking up a bottle of Burgundy, his fingers brushing lightly against Grace's in the process. The touch, though brief, sent an electric current through them both. For a moment they stood there paralyzed, their eyes locked on each other. The air between them seemed charged with electricity, with unspoken possibilities. Richard was the first to break the silence, his voice hoarse. "Grace, But before he could continue, the sound of footsteps coming down the stairs made them move away quickly. Michael appeared, carrying a box of decorations. "Sorry to interrupt," said Michael, his eyes narrowing slightly as he noticed the closeness between Grace and Richard. Clara asked me to bring this here for temporary storage. Sure, you can leave it in the corner, Richard replied, his voice regaining its usual professional tone. Grace took the opportunity to step back, her heart still beating fast. If you'll excuse me, I need to go back and help with the preparations upstairs. She hurried out of the basement, leaving behind a pensive Richard and a visibly upset Michael. The next few hours passed in a blur of frenetic activity. Grace moved around the mansion like a controlled hurricane, resolving minor crises, coordinating teams, and making sure everything was perfect for the big event. Meanwhile, in the garden, Michael was working tirelessly to put the finishing touches to the outside decorations. His thoughts, however, kept returning to the scene he had witnessed in the wine cellar. The intimacy he had felt between Grace and Richard disturbed him deeply. Determined not to lose Grace without a fight, Michael decided that he would use the gala dinner as his opportunity to declare himself. He prepared a small bouquet of rare flowers from the garden, planning to give it to Grace during the event. As the afternoon progressed, the first guests began to arrive. Clara, stunning in a navy blue gala dress, welcomed them with a radiant smile, the perfect hostess. Richard, elegant in his tuxedo, stood next to her, greeting the guests with charm and sophistication. Grace, dressed in a simple but elegant uniform, moved discreetly among the guests, making sure that glasses were refilled and that everyone was comfortable. Her eyes, however, kept being drawn to Richard, catching the moments when he seemed distracted, his gaze roaming the crowd as if looking for something or someone. When dinner was announced and the guests made their way to the dining room, Grace took a moment to breathe. She retreated to a quiet corner of the garden, closing her eyes and inhaling deeply of the fragrant night air. "Grace?" She turned, surprised to see Michael approaching, a small bouquet of flowers in his hands. "Michael," she smiled, although her eyes betrayed a slight apprehension. "The garden decorations look wonderful. You've done an incredible job." Michael smiled shyly, holding out the bouquet to her. "Thank you. I made these for you. They're rare flowers from the back garden. I thought they would suit you. Unique and beautiful." Grace took the bouquet, touched by the gesture. "Michael, it's beautiful. But Grace!" Clara's voice sounded from inside the house. "We need you in here." Grace cast an apologetic glance at Michael. "I have to go, but thank you, Michael, really." As Grace hurried back to the mansion, Michael watched her go, a mixture of hope and resignation in his gaze. Back in the dining room, Grace found Clara in a state of controlled agitation. "Grace, darling, Richard is acting strangely. He seems distracted, almost absent. Could you check if he's all right? Maybe he needs something." Grace nodded, her heart racing at the prospect of another encounter with Richard. She found him in a corner of the room, watching the guests with a distant gaze. "Mr. Bowers, is everything all right?" she asked softly. Richard turned to her, his eyes lighting up momentarily. "Grace," he murmured. Yes, everything's fine. Just a bit tired, I suppose." Grace noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes seemed to search for something beyond the elegant crowd. "Can I get you something, sir? A glass of water, perhaps?" Richard smiled, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "No, thank you, Grace, but could you stay here for a moment? Your presence is comforting." The request, so simple and yet so loaded with meaning, made Grace's heart flutter. She nodded silently, positioning herself next to him. For a few minutes they stood there side by side, watching the flow of guests, the elegant dance of champagne glasses and refined conversations. It was as if, for a brief moment, there was just the two of them, an island of calm in the midst of the social maelstrom. Across the room, Clara watched the scene with attentive eyes, her expression a mixture of confusion and growing suspicion. She noticed the way Richard seemed to relax in Grace's presence, the way his eyes followed her when she finally turned away to attend to another guest. As the evening progressed, the tensions and unresolved emotions seemed to grow, threatening to spill over at any moment. Grace moved between the guests, constantly aware of Richard and Michael's gazes, feeling the weight of her own conflicting emotions. Clara, for her part, watched everything with growing unease, her mind working to put together the pieces of a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. And so, as the gala dinner reached its climax, the personal dramas unfolding behind the scenes threatened to eclipse even the most elegant event. The stage was set for revelations, confrontations, and perhaps broken hearts. The night was still young, and secrets kept for so long were about to come to light. The gala dinner was in full swing, a symphony of elegant laughter, clinking glasses, and soft music. However, for Richard Bowers, the festive buzz seemed distant, as if he were watching everything through a hazy veil. His social smile, so well practiced over the years, remained fixed on his face, but his eyes betrayed a deep restlessness. As he chatted mechanically with a group of investors, Richard couldn't help but let his thoughts wander to Grace. The memory of their brief moment together in the wine cellar haunted him, the electricity of that accidental touch reverberating in his mind. "And what do you make of that, Richard?" The abrupt question from one of the investors brought him back to reality. Richard blinked, forcing himself to concentrate. "Excuse me, could you repeat the question? I think I got distracted for a moment." The investor frowned, but repeated his question about a possible corporate merger. Richard answered with his usual business acumen, but internally he was in turmoil. Excusing himself from the group, Richard walked away, seeking a moment of solitude. He found refuge in his office, closing the door behind him with a heavy sigh. The sudden silence was a welcome relief after the constant buzz of the party. Richard poured himself a whiskey, swirling the amber liquid in the glass as he approached the window. Outside, the garden was illuminated by hundreds of tiny lights, creating an almost magical scene. His eyes caught a movement, and he saw Grace walking among the guests in the garden, as graceful and efficient as ever. An involuntary smile appeared on his lips as he watched her, but it was soon replaced by an expression of guilt. What was happening to him? He was a married man, a pillar of the community, an example of integrity in business. How could he be having these thoughts about a female employee? Richard turned away from the window, running a hand through his hair in frustration. He loved Clara, didn't he? They had built a life together, had children, a reputation. But when was the last time he really felt connected to her? When was the last time a conversation with Clara made him feel truly alive, the way he felt when he was with Grace? The sound of a soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Richard, are you there?" It was Clara's voice. Richard took a deep breath, composing himself. "Yes, dear. I just came to pick up some papers. I'll be right out." He opened the door to find Clara standing on the other side, a worried expression on her face. "Is everything all right? You seem distant tonight." Richard forced a smile. "I'm fine, just a bit tired. You know how exhausting these events can be." Clara studied him for a moment, as if trying to decipher something in his expression. "Yes, I know. But you usually cope better. Are you sure there's nothing wrong?" For a brief moment, Richard considered opening his heart, telling Clara about his doubts, his inner conflicts. But the fear of the consequences, of the disappointment he would see in her eyes, made him back down. "I'm sure," he replied, leaning over to give her a quick kiss on the cheek. "Let's get back to the party. Our guests must be missing us." As they walked back to the main hall, Richard couldn't help but notice how Clara's touch, once so familiar and comforting, now seemed almost strange. Guilt consumed him again, mixed with a growing confusion about his own feelings. Back at the party, Richard tried hard to get involved in the conversations, to be the charming and attentive host that everyone expected. But his eyes kept searching for Grace in the crowd, as if she were a beacon in a turbulent sea. At one point, he saw her talking to Michael near the bar. The gardener was handing her a small bouquet of flowers, a gesture that made Richard feel an unexpected pang of jealousy. He watched the interaction with growing discomfort, noticing the blush on Grace's cheeks, the look of adoration in Michael's eyes. Without thinking, Richard approached the pair. "Grace," he called out, his voice firmer than he had intended. "We need more champagne on the main table." Grace turned around, surprised by the abrupt interruption. "Of course, Mr. Bowers. I'll take care of it right away." As Grace walked away to carry out her task, Richard and Michael exchanged a look laden with unverbalized tension. "The garden decorations are excellent, Michael," Richard commented, his voice controlled. "You've really outdone yourself this time." Michael nodded stiffly. "Thank you, sir. I did my best to make sure everything was perfect for Mrs. Bowers' event." The use of Clara's name did not go unnoticed by Richard. It was as if Michael was subtly reminding him of his place, of his duties as a husband. "Well, keep up the good work," Richard said, walking away quickly. He spent the rest of the evening in a state of inner turmoil, torn between his duty as host and husband and the growing desire to be close to Grace. Every time he saw her, every smile she threw in his direction, even if it was just part of her job, made his heart race. As the party began to wind down and the guests began to say goodbye, Richard found himself increasingly distracted. He made gaffes in conversation, mixed up guests' names, actions totally out of character. Clara, ever attentive, noticed these subtle changes. She watched her husband with a mixture of concern and growing suspicion, her eyes following the direction of his gaze with increasing frequency. Finally, when the last guest had left, Richard retired to the terrace seeking fresh air and a moment of clarity. The garden, now silent and bathed in soft moonlight, seemed like an oasis of calm after the whirlwind of the party. "Mr. Bowers?" Grace's soft voice surprised him. He turned, finding her standing at the entrance to the terrace, a worried expression on her face. "Grace," he replied, his voice hoarse. "I thought everyone had gone home by now." She took a hesitant step towards him. "I was just finishing organizing some things. Are you all right? You seemed upset during the party." Richard felt his heart race at her closeness. I don't know, Grace. I don't know if I'm all right." Before he could stop himself, he found himself venting, the words flowing like a torrent. "I feel lost, Grace, like I'm living a life that's no longer mine. Clara, the business, this house, everything seems so empty." Grace listened to him in silence, her eyes full of compassion. When he had finished, she took another step towards him. "Mr. Bowers, Richard," she said softly, "sometimes we all feel lost, but that doesn't mean we can't find our way back." Richard looked at her, feeling vulnerable in a way he hadn't experienced for years. "What if the way back isn't what I want? What if I want something different?" The air between them seemed charged with electricity. Grace opened her mouth to reply, but was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. "Richard, are you out there?" Clara's voice sounded from inside the house. Richard and Grace moved away quickly, as if they had been caught doing something wrong. Clara appeared at the entrance to the terrace, her eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of Grace. "Ah, there you are," Clara said, her voice laden with a false lightness. "Grace, thank you for all your help today. You can go home now." Grace nodded, casting one last glance at Richard before leaving. "Good evening, Mrs. Bowers, Mr. Bowers." As Grace disappeared, Clara turned to Richard, her eyes searching his face for answers. "What's going on, Richard? And don't tell me it's nothing. I've known you too long to believe that." Richard felt the weight of years of unsaid, repressed emotions pressing down on his chest. He looked at his wife, the woman with whom he had shared so many years of his life, and felt a wave of guilt and confusion. "Clara," he began, his voice trembling, "I think we need to talk." Clara's gaze softened, a mixture of fear and resignation in her eyes. "Yes, Richard, I think we really do." As the couple entered the house, the tension palpable between them, the silent night outside seemed to hold its breath, as if the universe itself was waiting for events to unfold. Richard's inner conflict had finally boiled over, threatening to change the course of several lives forever. In the quiet that followed the party, the seeds of change had been sown. It now remained to be seen what fruits they would bear, and who would be there to pick them when dawn came. The night of the long-awaited gala dinner finally arrived, enveloping the Bowers mansion in a blanket of expectation and glamour. The air was charged not only with the scent of fresh flowers and exquisite delicacies, but also with unresolved emotions and secrets that threatened to surface. Grace, dressed in a discreet but elegant uniform, moved through the halls of the mansion with rehearsed efficiency, her keen eyes catching every detail that might need last-minute adjustment. Her mind, however, was nowhere near as organized as her actions. The events of the last few days, the intimate moment with Richard in the wine cellar, Michael's attentions, Clara's growing suspicions, weighed heavily on her thoughts. While adjusting a floral arrangement in the entrance hall, Grace caught a glimpse of her reflection in an ornate mirror. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to be among the guests, wearing a dazzling dress, dancing in the arms of... She shook her head, pushing the fantasy away. There was no time for daydreaming. Not tonight. Upstairs, Richard was adjusting his bow tie in front of his bedroom mirror, his fingers trembling slightly. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions roaring in his chest. The man staring back at him in the reflection looked like a stranger, impeccably dressed in a tailored tuxedo, but with eyes that betrayed a deep unease. "You look beautiful," Clara's voice sounded behind him. Richard turned to see his wife, stunning in a sapphire blue gala dress that accentuated her eyes. For a moment, he saw in her the woman he had fallen in love with years ago, and a wave of guilt washed over him. "You look stunning, Clara," he replied, his voice hoarse. Clara approached, adjusting the lapel of her tuxedo with a familiar touch. "Is everything all right, Richard? You seem distant lately." Richard forced a smile. "I'm fine, darling. Just a bit nervous about the event, I suppose." Clara studied him for a moment, as if she could see through his facade. "Well, let's make this a dinner to remember, shall we?" Little did she know how prophetic her words would prove to be. Outside, in the lushly decorated garden, Michael was putting the finishing touches to the floral arrangements. His skilled hands worked with precision, but his thoughts were fixed on Grace. He gently stroked a rose petal, remembering the blush on her cheeks when he had handed her the bouquet. Tonight, he promised himself, tonight he would finally reveal his feelings. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the estate, the first guests began to arrive. Luxury cars paraded through the circular driveway, depositing the cream of local society, all dressed in their finest gala attire. Richard and Clara welcomed the guests at the entrance, the perfect couple in everyone's eyes. But for the most attentive observers, there was a subtle tension between them, an almost imperceptible space separating them. Grace circulated among the guests with trays of champagne, her face a mask of professional composure. But her eyes, almost against her will, kept searching the crowd for Richard. Every time their gazes met, even for a second, it was as if an electric current passed between them. The evening progressed, and dinner was announced. The guests made their way to the dining room, a vision of opulence with its long tables adorned with linen tablecloths, sparkling crystals, and exuberant floral arrangements. Richard, sitting at the head of the main table, made a toast, his voice resonating through the room. "To all our friends and partners here, thank you for sharing this evening with us. To friendship, to prosperous business, and..." His gaze wandered briefly to Grace, who was standing in a corner of the room. "To new possibilities." Clara, sitting next to Richard, noticed the hesitation in his voice and the direction of his gaze. Her expression hardened almost imperceptibly, but she kept her social smile. Dinner continued, a symphony of exquisite dishes and lively conversation. But beneath the surface of civility, emotions boiled over. Richard seemed distracted, his eyes frequently wandering around the room. Clara watched her husband with growing concern and suspicion. Grace moved efficiently between the tables, serving plates and filling glasses, but every time she passed close to Richard, the tension between them was palpable. Michael, who had been invited to join the dinner as a gesture of appreciation for his exceptional work in the garden, watched the interaction between Grace and Richard with a mixture of confusion and growing jealousy. When dinner reached dessert, the atmosphere in the room seemed charged with electricity. It was at this point that Clara, unable to ignore her suspicions any longer, decided to act. Rising gracefully, she clinked her champagne glass to attract attention. "Dear friends," she began, her melodious voice echoing through the room, I would like to propose a special toast this evening. A toast to loyalty, honesty, and... Her eyes fixed on Richard. Fidelity. A momentary silence fell over the room, the guests sensing but not fully understanding the underlying tension in Clara's words. Richard swallowed, his face pale. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Clara, I—" But before he could continue, a bang sounded from across the room. All eyes turned to see Grace, pale and trembling, standing over the shards of a crystal tray she had knocked over. I'm sorry," she stammered, bending down to pick up the shards. Michael stood up immediately, moving to help her. "Let me help you, Grace," he said softly, his hands gently pulling hers away from the sharp shards. The moment of tension was broken, the guests turning their attention to banal conversation, but the damage was done. Clara looked from Richard to Grace, her eyes shining with a mixture of hurt and anger. Richard looked like a man torn apart, his body tensed as if ready to run towards Grace, but trapped in place by years of social expectations and compromises. As Michael helped Grace to her feet, he couldn't help but notice the anguished look she cast in Richard's direction. At that moment, the truth he had been trying to deny became painfully clear. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of forced conversations and strained smiles. When the last guests finally left, the Bowers mansion seemed to exhale a collective sigh of relief. Clara, her composure finally breaking down, turned to Richard in the empty entrance hall. "We need to talk," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Now." Richard nodded silently, following her into his office. Before closing the door, his gaze met Grace's, who was standing in the hallway, an expression of guilt and fear on her face. Michael, watching the scene from a corner, felt his heart break. He approached Grace, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Grace," he said softly, "I think we need to talk too." Grace looked at him, unshed tears shining in her eyes. She nodded silently. As the Bowers locked themselves in their office for what promised to be a painful and potentially life-changing conversation, Grace and Michael walked out into the garden, the soft moonlight illuminating the path ahead of them. The evening of the gala dinner, which should have been the height of sophistication and social celebration, had become the catalyst for long-delayed revelations and inevitable confrontations. The masks had fallen, and now, in the silence that followed the storm, it remained to be seen what kind of morning would dawn for the inhabitants of the Bowers mansion. The silence that followed the tumultuous gala dinner hung over the Bowers mansion like a dense fog, laden with unspoken emotions and newly revealed truths. Grace found herself alone in her small room at the back of the property, sitting on the edge of her bed, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to process the night's events. Richard's face, pale and anguished, kept flashing through her mind. Clara's gaze, a mixture of hurt and restrained fury, haunted her. And Michael. Gentle, patient Michael, whose eyes reflected painful understanding as he led her out of the dining room. Grace closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her actions, or rather her unexpressed feelings, pressing down on her chest. How had things come to this? She had always prided herself on her discretion, her ability to maintain her composure in any situation. But tonight, in front of everyone, she had let her mask fall. A soft knock on the door brought her out of her thoughts. "Grace." Michael's voice sounded from the other side, gentle and hesitant. "May I come in?" Grace took a deep breath, trying to pull herself together. "Yes, Michael, come in." The door opened slowly and Michael walked in, still dressed in his elegant dinner clothes, but with his tie loosened and the first buttons of his shirt unbuttoned. His eyes, always so kind, now carried a shadow of sadness. "How are you?" he asked, sitting down in the only chair in the room, facing Grace. Grace let out a bitter laugh. "Honestly, I don't know. I screwed up, didn't I?" Michael shook his head slowly. "You didn't ruin anything, Grace. Sometimes things just happen. Feelings grow where they shouldn't. Situations get out of hand." Grace looked at him, surprised by his understanding. "Michael, I'm sorry. I know that I love you," Michael added softly. Yes, that's true. But love isn't about possessions, Grace. It's about wanting the best for someone, even if that means seeing them with someone else. Michael's words hit Grace like a punch in the gut. His kindness, his understanding, only made it harder. I don't deserve your kindness, Michael. It's not about deserving, Grace. It's who I am, and it's how I feel about you. Michael paused, his eyes searching hers. But the question now is, what are you going to do? Grace stood up abruptly, walking over to the bedroom's small window. Outside, the garden was bathed in silver moonlight, the flowers Michael had tended so lovingly glowing softly in the night. I don't know, she admitted. Part of me wants to run away, to leave all this behind. Another part wants to stay and face it, Michael added. Grace turned to him, tears finally escaping her eyes. How can I stay? Clara, she must hate me now. And Richard. Oh God, Richard. Michael stood up, approaching Grace but keeping a respectful distance. Grace, you need to be honest with yourself. How do you really feel about Richard? The question hung in the air between them, heavy and unavoidable. Grace closed her eyes, allowing herself for the first time to really examine her feelings. I love him, she whispered, the words coming out like a painful confession. I didn't want to, I didn't plan to, but it happened. And now I don't know what to do with that love. Michael nodded slowly, the pain evident in his eyes, but also a resolution. Then you need to talk to him, with both of them actually. Richard and Clara deserve to know the truth, and you deserve the chance to express your feelings. Grace looked at Michael, amazed at his strength and generosity. How can you be so understanding? A small, sad smile played on Michael's lips. Because I know you, Grace. I know the kind of person you are. You wouldn't do this on purpose. You wouldn't hurt anyone intentionally. Sometimes the heart just chooses for us. Grace felt a wave of gratitude for Michael, mixed with a twinge of regret for what might have been. In another world, in other circumstances, perhaps they could have had a chance. What should I do now? She asked, her voice small and uncertain. Michael took a deep breath. I think you need to give them some space tonight. Clara and Richard probably have a lot to talk about, but tomorrow you need to face it head on, talk to them, be honest about your feelings, and then, Grace asked, dreading the answer. And then you need to be prepared to accept the consequences, whatever they may be, Michael concluded softly. Grace nodded, feeling the weight of the decision she would have to make. She knew Michael was right. Running away wouldn't solve anything. She needed to face the situation, no matter how painful it was. Thank you, Michael, she said, her voice laced with emotion. I don't know what I'd do without you. Michael smiled, a smile full of love and resignation. You're stronger than you think, Grace. You'd find your way, with or without me. He turned to leave, but stopped at the door. Remember, Grace, whatever you decide, be true to yourself. It's the only way to find peace in the end. With those words, Michael left, leaving Grace alone with her thoughts and the monumental decision that awaited her. Grace spent the night tossing and turning in bed, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. She relived every moment with Richard, every glance, every accidental touch that made her heart soar. She thought of Clara, of the pain she saw in her eyes during dinner, and she thought of Michael, of his unwavering kindness even in the face of his own broken heart. By the time the first rays of the sun began to seep through the window, Grace had made up her mind. She got up, washed her face, and dressed carefully. Today was no day for the maid's uniform. Today she would face Richard and Clara as Grace, simply Grace, with all her flaws and complicated feelings. She left her room and walked towards the main house, her heart pounding in her chest. As she approached the back door, she saw Clara coming out, a determined expression on her face. Mrs. Bowers, Grace called softly. I'd like to talk to you, with you and Mr. Bowers, if possible. Clara turned, her eyes narrowing at the sight of Grace. For a moment, Grace feared that Clara was going to ignore her, or worse, throw her off the property right then and there. But then something in Clara's face changed, a mixture of resignation and curiosity, taking the place of the initial anger. All right, Clara finally said. "Richard's in the office. Let's get this over with." Grace followed Clara into the house, her heart hammering so loudly that she was sure everyone could hear it. As they walked down the corridor towards the study, Grace took a deep breath, preparing herself for what was to come. She knew that this conversation would change everything. There was no turning back after that, but she also knew it was necessary. For Richard, for Clara, for herself, and even for Michael. They all deserved the truth, no matter how painful it was. When Clara opened the office door, revealing Richard sitting behind his desk, looking tired and haggard, Grace felt a wave of emotions hit her. Love, guilt, fear, hope, all mixed together in an overwhelming whirlwind. But as she entered the room, Grace felt a strange calm envelop her. She was ready to face whatever came. Ready to be honest, to take responsibility for her feelings and actions, ready to accept the consequences, whatever they might be. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. After this conversation, nothing would be the same at the Bowers mansion, and Grace, for the first time in a long time, was prepared to face that future head-on. Richard Bowers' office, once a symbol of power and success, now seemed small and stifling. The air was charged with tension as Grace, Richard, and Clara stared at each other, each struggling with their own emotions and expectations for what was to come. Richard, sitting behind his imposing mahogany desk, seemed to have aged a decade during the evening. His eyes, normally lively and confident, were tired and apprehensive. Clara was standing by the window, her rigid posture betraying the emotional storm she could barely contain. And Grace, standing by the door, felt as if she were on the edge of a precipice, about to take a leap into the unknown. It was Clara who broke the tense silence, her voice surprisingly calm. "Well, Grace, you wanted to talk to us. We're listening." Grace took a deep breath, mustering all the courage she could find. I came to apologize. To both of you. My behavior, my feelings. They were inappropriate and caused us all pain." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but remained silent, his eyes fixed on Grace. "Apologies aren't enough, Grace," Clara replied, her voice taking on a sharp edge. "You betrayed my trust. You—" "Clara," Richard interrupted gently. "Let her speak." Clara cast a piercing glance at her husband, before gesturing sharply for Grace to continue. Grace swallowed, feeling the weight of her next words. "I fell in love with Mr. Bowers," she admitted, her voice shaking slightly. "It wasn't intentional, it wasn't planned. But it happened, and I know that doesn't justify anything, but I needed to be honest. With you, and with myself." The silence that followed his confession was almost tangible. Richard closed his eyes, as if in physical pain. Clara, surprisingly, let out a bitter laugh. "Honest? Now?" Clara shook her head. "Grace, you have no idea." "Clara," Richard interrupted again, his voice firmer this time. "There's something you need to know. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Grace and Clara looked at Richard, the tension in the room increasing even more. Richard stood up slowly, walking over to face the two women. "I have feelings for Grace too," he admitted, his voice low but clear. "Feelings that go beyond what should exist between an employer and an employee." Clara closed her eyes, as if she had been hit. Grace felt her heart racing, a confusing mixture of hope and guilt stirring in her chest. "But," Richard continued, his gaze moving between Grace and Clara, "that doesn't change the fact that I love my wife. Clara, our marriage may have faced difficulties, but you are still the woman I chose to share my life with." Grace felt as if the ground had been ripped out from under her feet. She took a step back, the tears she had fought so hard to hold back finally starting to fall. I understand," she whispered. I'll pack and leave right away." "Wait," Clara said, her voice surprisingly soft. She approached Grace, her eyes studying the young woman's face. "Do you really love him?" Grace, taken aback by the question, just nodded, unable to form words. Clara turned to Richard. "And what about you? These feelings for Grace, are they real?" Richard hesitated for a moment before answering. Yes, he finally admitted. But Clara, I choose you. I'll always choose you. Clara closed her eyes, breathing deeply. When she opened them again, there was a surprising determination in her gaze. Maybe it's not a question of choice. Richard and Grace looked at Clara, confused. What do you mean? Richard asked hesitantly. Clara let out a long sigh. Richard, our marriage hasn't been the same for years. We both know that. And while I still love you, I can't deny that something has changed between us. She turned to Grace. And you, Grace. I should hate you. Part of me wants to hate you. But I've seen how you look after this house, this family. I saw the goodness in you even when you were jealous. Grace looked at Clara, completely stunned. Mrs. Bowers, Clara, she corrected softly. I think, under the circumstances, you can call me Clara. Richard stepped forward, his face a mask of confusion. Clara, what exactly are you suggesting? Clara took a deep breath as if preparing to jump off a cliff. I'm suggesting that maybe there's room for all of us in this equation. The silence that followed was deafening. Grace looked from Clara to Richard, her heart beating so hard that she was sure they could hear it. Are you serious? Richard finally asked, his voice a mixture of incredulity and hope. Clara nodded slowly. It won't be easy. There will be challenges, prejudices to face. But if there's one thing I've learned over the years, it's that love, true love, sometimes comes in forms we don't expect. Grace felt her legs go weak and leaned against the nearest wall. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything yet, Clara replied. This is something we all need to consider carefully. It's not a decision to be made on the spur of the moment. Richard looked at his wife with new admiration. Clara, you always surprise me. Your strength, your understanding. Clara smiled sadly. It's not strength, Richard. It's survival. And maybe it's a chance for all of us to find a new form of happiness. The three of them sat in silence for a long moment, each absorbing the implications of what had been said and proposed. It was then that a soft knock on the door brought them back to reality. Michael entered hesitantly, his eyes widening as he saw the scene before him. Sorry to interrupt, he said, his voice betraying his confusion. I wanted to see if Grace was okay. Grace looked at Michael, feeling a wave of gratitude for his constant concern. She turned to Clara and Richard, a silent question in her eyes. Clara nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. Michael, why don't you join us? I think we have a lot to discuss. All of us. Michael entered hesitantly, closing the door behind him. He positioned himself next to Grace, his presence a source of comfort amidst the maelstrom of emotions. Richard looked at the group gathered in his office, his wife, the woman he had unexpectedly fallen in love with, and the man whose devotion to Grace was evident to all. He felt something change inside him, an openness to possibilities he had never considered before. So, he said at last, a slight smile forming on his lips, where do we start? Clara laughed softly, the sound breaking the tension in the room. How about some coffee? I think we could all use a cup while we browse through whatever that is. Grace felt a laugh bubble up in her chest, a mixture of relief, disbelief, and hope. I can prepare it, she offered. No, Clara replied gently. Today, Grace, you sit with us. As equals. As the group moved towards the kitchen, an atmosphere of cautious optimism hung in the air. The future was uncertain, full of challenges and possible obstacles, but there was also a promise of something new, something unexpected and potentially beautiful. In the Bowers mansion, where secrets and repressed desires had threatened to destroy relationships, a new form of love and understanding was being born. It was an outcome that neither of them could have foreseen, but which somehow seemed perfectly right. As they sat around the kitchen table, cups of steaming coffee in hand, Richard, Clara, Grace, and Michael prepared to take the first steps on an unknown journey. A journey of self-discovery, acceptance, and above all, love in its most diverse and surprising forms. The morning sun shone through the kitchen windows, casting a golden glow over the group. It was a new day, a new beginning. And at the Bowers mansion, love had found a way not only to survive, but to flourish in ways that no one could have imagined. If this story touched your heart, then don't forget to leave a like. Use the super thanks located just below the video to directly support the channel and help create more amazing content. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any updates. Now don't miss the next incredible story that's appearing on your screen. I greatly appreciate your support and hope to see you soon. Thank you for watching.